I want to start with the comment that Amartya has just made and amplify it a little bit, raise a couple of issues, and then turn to one really interesting and important comparison for us, and that is India and China, and a comparison of the economic development trajectories of these two giant economies. When Professor Bhagwati, I would say, criticized Amartya's book, he said that the essence of it is that one needs growth in order to be able to generate the basis for improved health and education, whereas the book by Professor Sen and Jean Drèze argues that investing in health and education is a crucial component of achieving economic growth, so it's not something that comes afterwards but comes alongside. When you read these books side by side, this debate as it was played out actually does not really appear so strongly in the pages, because both books make very clear that there are two kinds of investments that promote economic progress. And one is business investment, and the other is human investment. And in the book by Professor Bhagwati and Arvind Panaguria, our colleague is here, they call that track 1 and track 2, and they acknowledge that both of those are crucial for economic development. And clearly, Amartya and Jean Drèze say that both market-based growth and investments in health and education are also two complementary, crucial components of economic development. In other words, the argument that was portrayed as these two very different visions was a little bit hyped, I would say, in the sense that both investments through market activities, foreign direct investment, production in the market, business investment, clearly crucial for improving living standards and for raising per capita incomes and what that means for improvements of living standards. And it's clearly true that almost everybody that looks at this understands that that by itself is not enough to improve the quality of lives, nor is it enough to even generate the business environment in which market-based growth takes place. In other words, both for the quality of life and for the market investments, you also need a healthy and educated population. So these processes of investing in people and investing in the business sector work hand in hand in economic development. Of course, there are different emphases that are put on these two dimensions, and also in interpreting to some extent India's economic history since independence. I think almost everybody agrees that from the time of independence until at least the late 1980s or early 1990s, the market side of the equation was tied up in too many knots: bureaucracy, corruption, the license Raj, as it was famously called, and the economy was an over-regulated economy created in a vision of semi-socialism that did not produce the market-based economic growth. I don't think there would be too much disagreement on that part of the diagnosis. At the same time, I don't think there should be much disagreement at all about a central tenet of Amartya Sen's book, which is that alongside this was chronic underinvestment in health and education, really chronic underinvestment of a shocking extent, and an extent that is actually, in some level, deeply puzzling politically, because a democracy is supposed to find motivations for the politicians to cater to the votes and to the vote bank, and that should include, one would think, access to primary health care and education. But India notoriously underinvested in this. The debate between Amartya Sen and Jagdish Bhagwati is about relative emphasis. But I think the truth is that there was massive and chronic, and until this day, underinvestments in health and education of great significance. And at the same time, the business environment was deeply inadequate up until the early 1990s, and in many ways remains inadequate till today. So the problems are on both sides of an equation where you need these complementary parts working more effectively together. The one part of Professor Bhagwati's book that I could not accept is an argument actually by his co-author, Arvind Panaguri. I don't know if Arvind is here, an esteemed colleague of ours, who says that the argument about underinvestment in health is exaggerated because certain of the indicators that many of us look to, for example, the high malnutrition of Indian children, is actually a statistical artifact, that actually the health and nutritional conditions of Indian society are better than they look in the data. This, I think, is flatly wrong. The evidence, and almost everybody that looks at this would disagree with that complacency. The evidence deeply suggests that Indian children, to a shocking extent, are undernourished, that there's a high degree of stunting, chronic undernutrition, especially of girls, young girls, and that there's a lot of hunger that remains in India that is more than an illusion. And certainly, I've been working in the Indian health sector for now a dozen years. It is profoundly underinvested, and the quality of health access is miserable, though improving in recent years, still completely deficient, even given the level of income that India has. So my conclusion on this debate, is it markets or is it investment in people that have held India back? The answer is it has been both over the past 5 decades. Relative balance shifting at times, because since the 1990s, market reforms enabled more economic growth to take hold. That was not adequately reaped in the form of public investments in health and education, a major theme, correct and important theme of Amartya's book. The surpluses were not used to invest properly in the social or the human side, and spending on health care, for example, in India remains well under 2% of national income, arguably under 1.5% of national income. This is absolutely shocking on an international basis. This isn't a matter of poverty. This is a proportion of a low budget, and it's a shocking neglect of a critical sector. I myself have spent many years trying to cajole, convince, work with the ministers of health as they come and go, and with the prime ministers to raise the amount of spending on the health sector, because every time the spending goes up, you get good returns to it. More mothers survive childbirth, more children survive their first 5 years, their health conditions are better. In other words, there are really significant returns to investing in these sectors. Until today, India continues to underinvest. One of the big themes and puzzles, perhaps one of the most important questions in all of development economics, is why it is that China has so far outperformed India, especially in recent decades. And I know Amartya will want to say more about that, and writes about it in the book, but I'd like to just point out a couple of things for interest and for our discussion that will follow. India actually started out with a higher per capita income than China in the early 1950s. So this advantage of China today is not a long-standing advantage, it's a recent advantage. It was around 1992 in the official data that China overtakes India. It was as recent as that. China actually started out with a higher fertility rate as well, and a vastly higher population, of course. And yet India now is closing the population gap, not something to be proud of, and will overtake China and become the most populous country in the world within the next 15 to 20 years, probably peaking, according to most scenarios, at around 1.7 billion people, while China will peak at about 1.4 billion people and begin to decline.